So we begin with Dr. Beeman, who will offer his perspectives on what it might take for the U.S. to end its blockade and whether Iran's reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is a temporary or permanent development. Professor Beeman has written an excellent series of articles on this conflict, which you can read on the American Community Media website. Welcome, Professor Beeman.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being here today. Um, Now that the Strait of Hormuz is opened up, temporarily anyway, I think it's really very productive to reflect on the reasons for Iranian actions in this situation. And this goes back quite a long ways and also helps to explain quite a lot about how the Iranian regime is reacting both to the external pressure that it's being placed on it by Trump and the United States and Israel, and also why the Iranian regime continues to repress its own population. Uh, these two factors are very closely linked. There are two major important philosophical bases for the Iraq, excuse me, for the actions of the Iranian government. Pardon me. And these go back quite a long ways in history, but also have to do with the Iranian Revolution of 1978, 1979. One of the things that is the most important driving force in the actions of the Iranian government is the protection of Iranian national sovereignty. This is an extremely fundamental part of Iranian identity and also the current Iranian establishment in government. Iran has been dominated by foreign powers for almost 200 years in one way or another. And Iranians are extremely sensitive to the fact that foreign powers have intervened again and again and again in their internal affairs, and that they have been able to resist and maintain national integrity despite the fact that they've had this external interference. The Iranian Revolution in 1979, we oftentimes frame it as a religious revolution, but in fact, the most important part of the Iranian Revolution was their declaration that they were going to be neither East nor West. That is, that they were going to resist any colonial influence in their operations. The United States, in after the hostage crisis in 1979 and 1980, 1979, actually signed an accord, the Algiers Accord, with Iran in order to end the hostage crisis, in which the United States agreed in writing, signed, sealed, delivered, that it would never again interfere in Iranian internal affairs. And so, in this situation, the situation that we find ourselves in with Iran today, Iran is doing everything to protect the revolution and the ideals of the revolution, and also to protect its national sovereignty. And it's willing to go to extreme lengths in order to be able to do this. This is one of the most important points that the United States should understand. No amount of economic coercion, no amount of military coercion is going to deter the Iranian government from this major goal. And the internal incursions or the internal actions that the government has taken against its own citizens in the various kinds of protests that have taken place also, pardon me, also have to do with the fact that it is seen and framed as a threat to the revolution and to revolutionary values. So that citizens who protest against the government are, in the ideology of the current government, actually protesting against the revolution and against the revolutionary ideals. Um, from the outside, all of these actions look to be rather extreme, but when you understand the internal logic of Iran, yeah, in the pursuit of its actions, they make perfect sense. So you really do have to take the Iranian perspective in order to understand their motivations. But I can tell you that, and in the opening of the Straits of Hormuz, you also see Iran directing traffic through its territorial waters. That is an important point. The Straits of Hormuz, there's a certain amount in the straits that are in international waters, but Iran was originally directing traffic through its territorial waters in order to be able to get through the strait. And that is in order to, again, assert its national sovereignty. And the Strait of Hormuz then being in Iranian national waters, Iran could extract tolls or do anything really that would, again, uh, demonstrate to the world that Iran was, in fact, in control of its own territory and was not going to be intimidated by outside forces. The U.S. government seems to believe that coercion in the form of either economic coercion or military coercion is going to cause the Iranian government to capitulate. But to repeat what I just said earlier, this will not happen. And so this is an extremely important point that needs to be emphasized again and again and again. That simple leverage, simple force, simple coercion on the part of the United States or really any nation is not going to deter the Iranian government. They will go to the mat in order to be able to protect themselves, to protect their national sovereignty, and to protect the ideals of what they see as the revolution and the revolutionary values. So the Straits of Hormuz opened up when the Israeli Lebanese talks were successful. And again, you have to understand that the Iranian view of Lebanon and Hezbollah is also a projection of the revolution. Hezbollah is a projection. Hezbollah was created by Iran as a projection of the original 1978-1979 revolution. And so only when Israel and Hezbollah actually suspended their military actions was Iran willing to relent and allow the Strait of Hormuz to be opened up. This was not something that was done by the United States. It was done entirely by Iran and as a reaction to support for what they see as their revolutionary ideals. So, again, to sum up, the opening of the Strait of Hormuz is really something that was predictable if you understand the Iranian logic in this situation.
Professor Beeman, thank you. There are a number of questions for you, but I'll start. I'll take the moderator's prerogative. What do you expect on Tuesday when our 2-week temporary ceasefire ends? And how does President Trump exit this unpopular war while still managing to declare victory?
There is a bottom line for the Iranians aside from what we've already been talking about, and that is the right to enrich uranium. Iran and the United States, starting in 1968, actually, they were founding members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty guarantees all non-nuclear weapon states the right to peaceful development of nuclear power, and it requires the nuclear weapon states to protect the right of non-nuclear weapon states to enrich nuclear power. Aside from Iran, non-nuclear power states that enrich uranium have an active uranium enrichment program include Argentina, Brazil, the Netherlands, Germany, and Japan. All of these countries have nuclear enrichment programs within their own borders. Only Iran has been singled out as being required to completely suspend or to completely eliminate its nuclear enrichment program, which Iran declares is for peaceful purposes. And by the way, there is no evidence anywhere by any body, any governmental body or international body that Iran actually has or ever had or ever will have a nuclear weapons program. This is a complete fabrication. So Iran is insisting again because for its national sovereignty and for its rights as an equal partner under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and an equally respected state within the international community, that it be allowed to exercise its treaty rights and to continue with peaceful development or with uranium enrichment and peaceful development of nuclear energy. Now, again, I know we know all very well that there are people who have managed to imply that Iran might possibly someday maybe be developing nuclear weapons, and they're using that as a pretext to attack Iran's program. But Iran will protect its sovereign rights, and this is the real sticking point in the negotiations. If the United States insists that Iran completely dismantle its nuclear program, the talks will not go forward. And so there must be some compromise. We've seen some suggestions that, for instance, Iran could suspend uranium enrichment for 5 years or for 10 years, but completely eliminating Iran's rights to the development of nuclear technology is a non-starter. It must not be pursued by the United States if we want this to end.
Thank you. Our first question comes from Nestor Fantini. Nestor, please ask your question.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Dr. Beeman, there have been statements from the Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, invoking biblical terminology, and even President Trump explicitly warned that a whole civilization will die if his terms were not accepted. From your perspective, Dr. Beeman, how should we understand this kind of rhetoric? Does it risk framing the conflict not just as a geopolitical, but also as a civilizational or even implicitly religious? And what are the consequences of that framing for how the war is perceived in the Middle East and globally?
Well, this rhetoric is extremely unfortunate. And the reason is because, of course, history and memory of history is very long. And when you see these pronouncements being made by President Trump and by Pete Hegseth, it immediately evokes the Crusades. And this is not something that is, from the standpoint of the United States, which was founded long after the Crusades. This doesn't have much meaning for the American public or American citizens, but for people in the Middle East, it's very meaningful, deeply meaningful, and when in fact it's used as a slogan for colonial powers throughout the Middle East, not just in Iran. So the idea that crusaders are going to come and conquer the territory of the Islamic world, which is what took place in the 12th and 13th centuries. This is a hot button issue, and I am extremely. I honestly, I kind of wonder whether Pete Hegseth and Trump are not purposely using this kind of Christian symbolism in their attempt to sell this to the conservative Christian communities throughout the United States. Because among Christian conservative communities, the idea of a recapturing or a securing of Jerusalem and the Holy Land is still a very potent issue in American politics. This is why conservative Christians are so supportive of the state of Israel, because they believe that the second coming of Jesus will take place when Israel is secured and a new Messiah comes. And it is a very heavy religious issue. For the rest of the world, these seem like casual or even careless pieces of rhetoric, but actually they are very clearly coded to try to appeal to Christians in the United States. But unfortunately, they're also very heavily coded for people in the Islamic world, and it tends to inflame the situation in a manner that is absolutely not productive. And so I'm extremely sorry that they've chosen to conflate these symbolic and religious terms with more practical political matters.
Thank you.
Professor Beeman, there are a number of questions for you in the chat, but in the interest of time, we're going to move on to Dr. Ryan Nunn. Could you please answer some of the questions in the chat? And as we move on to our final round of questions, we'll take some of those live. There are about 5 questions for you there. So we next welcome Dr. Ryan Nunn from the Budget Lab at Yale, who will discuss the hit to the U.S. economy as we manage this conflict and the spike in consumer goods, U.S. consumer goods. Welcome, Dr. Nunn.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here with you all today and looking forward to the conversation. So I am an economist and director of research at the Budget Lab, so I'll be focusing on the macroeconomic picture in what I say today. And I'd like to talk briefly about what we've learned from our own research, as well as others, on the effects that we should expect to see from the current energy market turmoil. It's a little hard to know how big this oil shock actually is, let alone what its economic implications are. I was originally prepared to tell you that we've seen roughly a $35 per barrel increase since before the conflict. In the US, the price of oil was about $65 per barrel just before the conflict, and about $100 in the daily data that I have most recently from earlier this week. And if you stack that against other monthly changes in US oil prices, this is one of the largest increases we've experienced over the last 50 years. But given how oil futures have fallen just in the last 24 hours, it would certainly be reasonable to expect prices to fall somewhat from here. So what does this all mean for the US economy? When oil prices go up, gas prices go up, but that's, I think, no surprise to anyone here. Our analysis looked at the broader macroeconomic effects in the US. And what we found was that when oil prices spike, you do tend to see inflation, you see prices rise while economic activity declines. And to understand the current turmoil, we really want to look at the historical experience in the US with other oil price shocks. And so I want to take just a little bit of time to talk through the methodology of this. That in our view, it's really not good enough to simply look before and after historical oil price changes, because a booming economy can cause oil prices to rise for reasons that really have nothing to do with supply and everything to do with rising demand. So we use a nice design from economist Diego Kanzig that looks in a very tight time window around OPEC announcements to just identify the changes that are truly about supply contractions and nothing else that's happening at the same time. For the moment, assume that the $35 price shock persists for an entire quarter. When we use data from the last 20 years or so, our analysis indicates that 1 year from now, we could expect to see a little less than a 0.5% rise in the core price level. That's the level that excludes energy. And a little less than a 0.5% fall in economic activity, in GDP. Now, that might sound small, but you do want to consider that GDP is roughly $30 trillion in the US. So that means about 115 billion less in output in a year. But I want to put this in some context. So oil price shocks actually appear to have less bite in the US than they used to. Still significant, but less than previously. Those effects are smaller than they once were because the US requires less oil to make $1 of GDP now than it used to. And in turn, that's because our fuel efficiency has improved, and because economic growth has tended to skew away from the really oil-intensive production of prior decades. The US also produces a lot more oil than it used to, and is now a net exporter of crude and petroleum products. And so now there are more offsetting positive and negative effects from a rise in the price of oil. Investment tends to eventually go up, partially offsetting the decline in consumption that you get from the increase. So that's really the big picture macroeconomically, but what does this all mean for consumers? So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about how inflation hits different people in different ways. In general, this kind of inflationary shock hits lower income households especially hard in the following general ways. They tend to spend more on goods as a share of their budgets than higher income households do. They can't substitute to cheaper alternatives as easily as higher income households. I think that's an intuitive difference there. And they have less of a savings buffer. So those are sort of some high level reasons. But if you were to just look at the different baskets of goods and services that are consumed by low and high income households, you could expect higher inflation for lower income households from this particular energy shock. So as a share of their consumption, low income households spend more on energy than high income households do. They are also harder hit by any increases in unemployment rate that comes with a slowing economy were that to occur. And if you look specifically at oil supply contractions, other researchers have found that they hit households with less education harder than other households. But stepping back a bit and thinking again about the nature of the shock that we're experiencing economically, the duration and the uncertainty both matter, not just the magnitude of the initial changes. So a lot is going to depend on how prolonged this all turns out to be, and in particular, how quickly production and trade can be restored in the aftermath of the shock. So again, as an economist, I like to look back at what we can see in the data that might help us to understand what's going on now. And historically, oil price shocks, they tend to take a while to subside. On average, it took about 1.5 years for oil price shocks to fall back to even just half of their size after an initial shock. That's a pretty long period. But I should note that those shocks did come from a different source. I mentioned earlier that we were looking at OPEC shocks and their supply constraints. The current shock is pretty different for lots of reasons that we just heard about. And we would want to think about how those differences might matter to how prolonged this could be. One thing that is potentially different this time is that there have been reports of considerable damage to energy infrastructure in the Middle East, and one might expect that to make the shock more persistent. But what I will leave you with is that obviously this is very tough for any of us to model and forecast just given that it depends on so many unknowns, including in the conduct of foreign policy. And we're seeing that play out just in the last 24 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nunn. We have several questions for you in the chat, but I have a question. To break this down, what can consumers expect to see at the gas this weekend, given that oil prices have plunged, as you mentioned?
Well, I think you want to be a little cautious just because the linkages between the oil price and all of the prices, that folks see at the pump or in other consumption that they do, those linkages are not instantaneous. And they might even be asymmetric in the sense that prices going up and prices going down could have different patterns. What I will say is that in the most recent inflation data that we all look at from the Consumer Price Index and other sources, you do see the imprint of this energy shock already. So for March, we saw the overall prices rising to a quite large extent relative to prior months by almost 1%, after rises of 0.2 and 0.3% in the prior months. And that was driven principally by energy, by gasoline and other energy-related products. So we are already seeing this in the price data. What we will see in terms of near-term fluctuations in price, I wouldn't really be able to project.
Okay. Our first question for you comes from Rebecca Bartis. Rebecca, please ask your question.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, is what we are seeing now the full extent of the damage, or is the real impact still to come as rising oil prices translate into even higher costs in consumer prices?
I think that's certainly a good question. What we saw in our analysis, again, looking historically, focusing on the last 20 years, I should reiterate that I think part of why the effects for the United States have fallen somewhat is that we do have the ability to bring more oil production online in the last kind of post-fracking era, the last 20 years. In that era, looking at the data, you do see that effects on GDP, on economic activity, do tend to diminish as you go out beyond a year in our analysis, but they're pretty persistent over the year after the shock. So just again, looking just at that high-level analysis, I think we see that kind of a pattern. Whether we could expect to see more of the price impact in the coming weeks and months is a little hard to say.
Hey, Orhan Kurt has the next question for you. Orhan?
Yes, hi. So which question do you want me to ask?
Please ask either question. Yeah.
Does the prolonged war in Iran could tip the global economy into recession? That's the first question that I have. Second question, so do you think the market will recover after the Iran war, or do you think it's kind of this is not temporary, it might be permanent? And also, I have another question. Do you think the Iran economy might recover if Iran will charge every ship that using the Strait of Hormuz? So because they're talking about the $1 billion revenue if they will start charging and they keep charging.
So I think that your first and third questions about the global picture will be better answered by our next speaker than by me. My work here has really focused just on the U.S. So I'm not sure. And now having thought about that, I've lost track of your second question, if you don't mind repeating it.
Sure. So the market in US. So will the market recover after the Iran war, since we are in some temporary?
And that's such a good question, Orhan, because if you note, the stock market has gone up this week. And it was a question I was going to ask you as well, Dr. Nunn. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I think that I'd take a step back and say equities markets, other markets that can move immediately in response to news are going to have you're going to have an experience with those that's quite different than the kind of underlying economic dynamics that take much longer to play out. So, um, prices will reflect all of this information that's coming in, and we've seen a lot of movement in those prices as different twists and turns of the crisis have unfolded. I think I would come back to something that I said a little while back, which was that while certainly significant, while real, the economic impacts for the US shouldn't be exaggerated. They are smaller than they would have been in prior decades. They are not of a size that by themselves would tend to um, create a huge disruption in the U.S. economy. Certainly, they're going to be tough for many households to deal with. They're going to be very real burdens for many people. But by itself, this is not a shock that would be as large as those that you saw back in the 70s, for example.
Interesting. Henrietta Burrows has the next question for you, and then we'll move on to Dr. Deolalikar, although there are a number of questions for you in the chat, Dr. Nunn. Henrietta, please ask your question.
Thanks so much, Sunita. If the U.S. is now an exporter of oil, would the country really want or need to exploit Venezuela's oil? I mean, that was what's a reason some gave for the U.S.'s invasion of Venezuela. And would the U.S. be off the hook for, let's say, trying to get oil from the Middle East?
So I think I need to stick in my economist lane a bit here, and I don't think I can really speak to kind of the reasons for foreign policy or any of that. It is true that with the advent of fracking technologies, their implementation in the U.S., we are now producing much more oil and petroleum products, and that does tend to balance us a little more than we used to be on the consumption and production sides. But as for what that means for the conduct of foreign policy, I couldn't say.
Dr. Nunn, a final question for you from me before we move on to Dr. Deolalikar. You had mentioned that we need less oil than we have traditionally. Does that come from our use of alternative energy? Is that the reason why we need less oil?
I think that's one contributor. And so just to be clear about that, my original statement, it's we're using less oil per dollar of output that we produce. And a part of that is increased efficiency. In the transportation fleet, of course, we have more hybrid vehicles than we used to. We have electric vehicles. And we are looking to alternative sources of energy more than we did in prior decades. So that is part of the story, though not the entirety of it.
Well, thank you so much. There are additional questions for you in the chat, and I hope you'll answer them there. Our final speaker today is Dr. Anil Deolalikar from UC Riverside, who will discuss the hit to the global economy. Dr. Deolalikar will hone down on countries that are hardest hit by supply chain disruptions, and he will give us a case study of India, where LPG, which is used in cooking, is in short supply. Welcome, Dr. Deolalikar. You're muted, sir.
Okay. Thank
There
you,
you go.
Sunita. Thank you, Sunita. I'm very happy to be on this panel and looking forward to the questions and any discussion we have later on. So let me start off backtracking a little and say that the oil price increase that we have seen over the last 2 months, ever since the beginning of the Iran war, is a little different than many other price increases in raw materials, because petroleum is not just used in transport, as most people think, but it is a raw material that is used in thousands and thousands of everyday products beyond gasoline. And that includes plastics, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, clothing, and then, of course, natural gas is used primarily for cooking, but also in transportation of public transit vehicles, and so on and so forth. And that's why oil price increases, sudden oil price increases of the type that we experienced in the 1970s and that we are experiencing today, uh, can lead to a fairly sharp spike in general inflation, and that can often put economies in stagflation. We saw this in the 1970s. The stagflation that we experienced worldwide in the 1970s was largely because of the oil price increases at that time. So that's sort of a good sort of fact to keep in mind, why oil prices are different than other commodity prices. Now, the oil price increase has, if you sort of look at just the IMF forecast on what is happening to the global economy, what will likely happen to the global economy, you don't see too much of an impact of the sort of disruption in the global economic growth rate might be of the order of 0.5% or 1 percentage point, and that may, on the face of it, not look very, very large. But I think what one has to keep in mind is that this oil price increase has impacted most the poor and lower middle income countries in the world. We are talking about countries in the Middle East itself, as well as countries in sub-Saharan Africa, countries like Yemen, Sudan, and Somalia already face extreme hunger. And one of the effects of the oil price increases, you are going to see, and you have already seen, a sharp spike in food prices worldwide. And this makes, especially for people who are sort of living right at the margin of existence, an increase in food prices of even 10 or 20% can often mean the difference between life and death, or between nutrition and extreme malnutrition. Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan are also teetering on the border of economic collapse due to the regional war, and there is a likely effect of the Iran war on all of these countries, a big adverse impact, including possibly if the war spreads regionally, as we saw at least in the initial days and weeks of the war. We might sort of see large-scale migration, we might see refugee flows, and all that. But then there is another set of countries that have been impacted a lot by the oil price increase induced by the Iran war, and those countries are in Asia, especially South Asia. These are countries like India, Pakistan, and of course in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, that do depend quite a bit on energy imports, on oil imports for their energy needs. And I'm going to, as Sunita mentioned, I'm going to primarily focus on India today. India is an interesting case study because India imports roughly 35 to 50% of its crude oil uh, uh, through the Gulf countries that border along the Strait of Hormuz. So the closure of the Strait of Hormuz really affects India in a profound way. Now, to some extent, this situation is a little better than before because India had diversified in the last couple of years after the Ukraine war. It had diversified its oil imports and was relying quite a bit on oil imports from Russia. But as we know, the U.S. has been putting pressure on India to cut back on its oil imports from Russia. And although over the last 4 weeks, India got a reprieve, as did most countries, by the US lifting sanctions on Russian oil. I read today that the US is not allowing in India, those sanctions have actually been reimposed, and the US is not allowing India to be exempted from the Russian oil sanctions. And so this comes back to India's very strong dependence for its crude oil imports on crude oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. But the situation is even worse when you look at India's reliance for liquid petroleum gas, LPG, as well as LNG. Nearly 50% of India's LNG, the liquid natural gas, and 90% of LPG, India's LPG imports come through the Strait of Hormuz. So I think one of the strongest impacts on India has been the sharp spike in LPG prices. In fact, a shortage of LPG throughout the country. One of the things about India is that India is a lower middle income country, perhaps not as poor as some of the sub-Saharan African countries, but it is a low middle income country, and a good 20 to 25% of its population lives below the poverty line. Now, I have to add that the official Indian government poverty estimate is unusually low. The government claims that 5% of India's population is now poor, down from something like 50% 3 decades ago. But I think that's partly because the poverty line that they have used recently is somewhat overly limited. And if you use the poverty line that the World Bank uses worldwide, not the extreme poverty line, but there's sort of a normal poverty line, you get almost 20% to 25% of Indian households that continue to live in poverty. But even this hides what is really happening in the real world, because there are many, many households, a very large proportion of households that live just above the poverty line. And so when you have a disruption of this type that we have seen lately, and there's a spike in inflation, and the costs of food and other consumer durables increases sharply, a lot of households that previously were not officially poor fall into poverty. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how these oil price increases have impacted both rural as well as urban consumers and residents in India. So you have to realize that nearly 50% of India's population relies on agriculture for its livelihood. And roughly 20% of GDP, India's GDP, comes from agriculture. And so there's a lot of rural households, and they have been impacted significantly by this oil price increases, because as it is, many of these households are small farmers. They are small and marginal farmers who really live at the border of subsistence. I mean, many of them live from literally paycheck to paycheck. They have to borrow at the start of the agricultural season for their seeds, for the fertilizer, diesel, labor, and then they often repay landlords or banks from whom they borrow after the harvest. And so I think this means that their finances depend quite a bit on stable input prices. And what we have seen after the Iran war, especially in the last 2 months, is that input prices, especially prices of fertilizer, have shot up incredibly. And this has put a lot of farmers into a great deal of difficulty because the cropping season is just it was just sort of started for the winter crops. It had started in January, and then in February you sort of saw these input prices increase, and this has put a lot of farmers in distress. As it is, even before the Iran war, you often heard about many small farmers in India committing suicide because they were highly indebted to begin with, and I think this has really increased the debt load on farmers, especially the small and medium farmers. Now, when we talk about, and again, as I mentioned, the primary culprit here is fertilizer and diesel. Farmers depend on both fertilizer and diesel quite a bit. You also have a very large class of the poor in the rural areas in India. We call them landless laborers, or these are workers who rely exclusively. They have no land of their own, but they rely on work from larger farms for their livelihood. And these farmers obviously also are impacted. There's sort of a second order effect on them. When farmers get squeezed, the landless laborers, wage laborers also get squeezed in an even bigger way, because the first thing that small and medium farmers try to save on is the outside labor that they hire in for their planting, harvesting, and other needs. So this has really impacted the livelihood of the farm lobby in India in a big way. And I'm not even yet discussing how the increase is affecting their consumption needs, because many of these farmers rely on cooking gas and kerosene for their preparation of food. And so from both the supply side, from the income side, as well as from the food preparation side, from the consumption side, they have had a double squeeze on them. I expect, again, this is all too recent, so we don't have any hard numbers yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a spike in the number of farmer suicides over the next month or two. We see a huge increase in rural indebtedness as a result of this war.
Dr. Deolalikar, oh, sorry, please go on.
I'll just take a couple of minutes. Moving to the urban areas, I think in the urban areas, we have seen big LPG. I think there have been lots of stories in the media about how the LPG shortage has impacted urban consumers. A lot of households are foregoing LPG. Indian middle class tends to rely a lot on these gas cylinders, the LPG cylinders, for their cooking needs. And as these are in extremely short supply and prices have rocketed up by 200, 300, 400% in many Indian towns, households simply have resorted to firewood and kerosene, even in towns. And of course, this is going to impact air pollution very soon. As it is, Indian cities are already pretty polluted to begin with. The air quality is abysmal, as you know, and this is going to make the pollution in these cities even worse. But sort of diverting from urban consumers, urban middle class consumers, one has to realize that urban informal workers are a big proportion of urban India. In fact, India is unusual amongst middle-income countries in that it has a very high proportion of informal workers engaged in the economy. It is estimated that anywhere from 60 to 70% of India's labor force is informal, either farmers or urban informal workers. These are people like rickshaw or auto rickshaw drivers, delivery riders, domestic workers, vendors. And so all of them have been impacted by the oil price increase. The LPG, for instance, has put many food vendors totally out of business. Their livelihoods are completely gone overnight because there is no way that they can sell food at a reasonable cost. The food that they prepare by the roadside just becomes prohibitively expensive, and the demand for their services has just cratered. So all in all, I don't want to sort of take too much time here. There's some anecdotal evidence that 20% of the earnings of urban informal workers in India has disappeared overnight because of this oil price increase. And this is going to now push a lot of people into poverty. So I would not be surprised if we don't have poverty estimates done regularly, but I would not be surprised if the 20 to 25% poverty rate that we have has been pushed up to 40% literally over these last 2 months.
Dr.
So it's really had a
Deolalikar,
profound impact on India, and so I was just using India as a case study, and there's already another bit of anecdotal evidence suggesting that this has created reverse migration. A lot of the urban informal workers have moved to the urban areas from rural areas, and because their livelihoods have simply disappeared, many of them are returning to the rural areas. So let me stop there. Sunita, you had a question.
Yes, there are a number of questions for you, but with the using India as a case study, there are many countries around the world that you mentioned that are currently facing food insecurity. We come upon the critical farming season, which starts in May, as farmers start to plant their seeds around the world. Are they going to be able to do that successfully with the shortage in fertilizer?
No, they wouldn't. I think this is really going to impact we are going to see a huge impact on food prices over the remainder of this year. Because as farmers cut back throughout the world on planting, you will sort of see a delayed impact on food crop harvests later on in the year as the agricultural cycle moves on.
We have a question from Carlos Roa. Carlos?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Sunita. Professor Deolalikar, could you please elaborate on how has India recently diversified its energy sources, please?
Well, India has not been as aggressive as, say, China in moving to renewable energy sources. China is somewhat protected from this oil price increase because it has shifted dramatically to sources like wind, solar. And India has not, unfortunately, been as aggressive in shifting to renewable sources. And so I think India has been impacted a fair bit. Now, as I mentioned, in terms of just oil imports, India had diversified after the Ukraine war by shifting to Russian oil. But then soon after that, the United States started putting pressure on India to cut back on Russian oil imports. And India had been doing that until very recently, a month ago, when America lifted its sanctions on Russian oil, and then India was sort of trying to move back to Russian oil to make up for the deficit from the Persian Gulf. But now the United States is cracking down on India's imports of Russian oil as well. So that puts India in a very bad spot.
Absolutely. We do have a number of questions for you, but in the interest of time, we're going to go to 30-second sound bites from each speaker. Let's start out with Professor Beeman. Professor Beeman, what is the most important point that you'd like to leave with reporters today?
I guess the most important point is that one, in order to successfully negotiate with Iran, one must fully understand the Iranian perspective from their historical and cultural background. And if that is not done, then negotiations can't ever succeed. And almost everything that we've seen in Iranian conduct during the current conflict stems directly from, again, the cultural and historical background that has driven the revolution and is the underlying philosophy of this administration.
Thank you. Dr. Nunn.
So I would say these are still early days for understanding all these economic impacts I talked about. But when we look at the recent past, we see evidence of a few things. First, effects on consumer prices and economic activity in the US are real, but likely smaller than they used to be. Second, it usually takes quite a while for a shock to fully subside. And third, the inflation that these shocks generate tend to be a special burden on lower income consumers.
Thank you. Dr. Deolalikar, last word to you.
I think my main point would be that even if we see oil prices decline now, some of the damage to the poorest countries in the world and to the most vulnerable populations in the world has already been done, and we may not be able to undo it as quickly. And so you are probably going to see a big increase in indicators like poverty, farmer suicides, malnutrition of children. We are going to see these over the next year or two, no matter what happens to oil prices now or in the immediate future. The damage is done.
Speakers, thank you so much for your excellent remarks and insights today. We really appreciate you making the time to join us.